Hello, and thank you for joining Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. My name is Ashley Burrell. I'm the Secretary of the Board for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. We will be producing monthly podcasts featuring women of color in the peace and security field, so please visit WCAPS.org regularly for more details.
Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to another podcast for the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, or WCAPS. I'm very happy to be able to have a conversation today with Christine Ahn, who's doing some amazing work trying to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula and bringing women of color and other women to the forefront to really be, at the table and to really move decision-making on issues of peace and security and conflict transformation. So it's a real honor for me to have Christine here to talk with us, and she has a very busy schedule doing all this amazing work. So we're really happy that she's able to spend some time with us today. So Christine.
Thanks so much.
Oh, great. I'd love to start with you just saying a little bit more about yourself, who you are, and we'll start with that first, and then we'll get a little bit more into the work that you're doing in your organization.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Bonnie. I'm the founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ. We're a global movement of women mobilizing for peace on the Korean Peninsula. We were founded in 2015 when we organized a historic crossing of the demilitarized zone. It's the most fortified border in the world. Obviously, everybody has seen those images of Panmunjom with the North and South Korean soldiers, armed soldiers, facing off each other. And, there's 1.2 million landmines in that DMZ. And so it has been a site of division, a site of war. And so we crossed that, and 30 international women from 15 countries, many from countries that fought in the Korean War. That was from 1950 to 53. And we did it for Korean women who want an end to this war. They want a peace treaty signed between the United States and North Korea, and normalized relations between North Korea and South Korea. And so we did it, calling for this peace treaty, calling for the reunion of families. Millions of Koreans, North and South, and even Korean Americans remain separated from their loved ones in North Korea. And so we did that, calling for family reunions. And, most importantly, I think it's women's leadership in the peace process. So that's what we did. We held symposiums, women peace symposiums in Pyongyang with about 250 North Korean women. We had a peace symposium in Seoul with a similar amount. And, it was an opportunity to hear from both North and South Korean women about how the unresolved war is still impacting them today. And we were also able to share. We had sisters from Nobel Peace Laureates like Lema Gbowee from Liberia, and Mairead Maguire from Northern Ireland, Patricia Guerrero, who's a human rights lawyer who created the City of Women in Colombia, Suzuya Takasato, who started Okinawa Women Against Military Violence in Japan, share also with North Korean women the power of women organizing to end conflict and to end violence in their communities. So it was an inspiring trip. And not to mention, we marched with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ, in both Pyongyang and in Kaesong on the north side, and in Paju on the south side. And, I think we made a splash. We were definitely on the Times Square ticker tape. Gloria Steinem and Women Cross DMZ crossed the DMZ, and the most trending issue on Facebook. And we got global coverage on CNN, New York Times. And I think, it really brought home, there tends to be a misperception about the Korean War, and it's just a war between North Korea and South Korea. Well, because of the systematic erasure of what happened in that brutal 3-year war. People don't, especially Americans, don't realize this is a war that still needs to be ended between the US and North Korea. So that's a little bit about what we did in 2015. And since then, we've been continuing our work to educate, organize, and advocate for a peace treaty.
And also, I mean, that's just amazing. And maybe you could also say a little bit about your background. What led you to wanting to do all of this work?
Well, I was born in South Korea, so I immigrated to this country when I was 3, and I lived, all over the United States. I actually went to high school in Langley, Virginia, where the CIA is, and so I'd say that that's probably where I got my kind of political edge, is growing up with all these kids whose parents were congressmen and Supreme Court justices. But, I myself, came from a working class immigrant family. And so I actually moved around quite a bit with my older sisters just because my parents they were old, they didn't speak English, and it was rough and tumble. So I really grew up with that kind of working class immigrant paradigm, but then was thrust into this incredibly privileged setting with my oldest sister, who was pretty successful as a businesswoman, and living with her and her husband. And so I would say that, both my kind of personal experience, I am the youngest of 10 children, 9 girls and 1 boy, really helped me, I think, learn to navigate working with women and be kind of a peace builder within my own family. So that's kind of the personal backdrop. And then, I studied peace and conflict studies and political science when I was in college. And I actually did a lot of volunteering. I traveled to countries like Jamaica, to Mexico, really got kind of a critical education about U.S. foreign policy, the role of the IMF and the World Bank in impacting, developing countries. And so that was like a foundational education that I got. And then I actually spent some years working in Washington, D.C., with like the legal aid and Bread for the City and Zacchaeus Free Clinic. And, I was there at a time when Bill Clinton signed the welfare bill, which, had devastating consequences, especially for women of color. And so, yeah, I would say that, I've always been kind of looking critically both at like the U.S. foreign policy and working at the intersection of how that impacts domestic policy, and even to like the various grassroots level. And then it really was when I was a graduate student at Georgetown, I was in a course at the School of Foreign Service, and Bob Gallucci came to give a talk about his experience in the Oval Office when the Clinton administration, the newly minted administration, almost went to war with North Korea, almost did a preemptive strike on the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. And I had this, oh my goodness, I'm Korean American and I know nothing about this history. And so I wrote a paper, and I came across this NPR interview with a guy named Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute, who won a MacArthur Genius Award because he did this incredible analysis where he found that the famine in North Korea, where up to 1 million North Korean people perished in a famine, was due to an energy crisis. And I just found that analysis so fascinating. And I got a Ford Foundation Fellowship to go work with him and the Nautilus Institute in Berkeley. And that began my journey, because while I was there, I met some extraordinary Korean Americans, many who were from divided families, many who were part of the pro-democracy movement in South Korea. And I'd say I kind of became a kind of a Gramscian public intellectual. I really learned on the ground, connected to social movements, going to South Korea, going to North Korea, um, and really just kept studying and learning from people that have been in the struggle for peace and the reunification of Korea. And, once I knew what I did, I felt I had a responsibility as a US citizen, from a country that has had such a heavy hand on the Korean Peninsula. And that, that what happened there very much tied to our security here at home. So it's been an incredible journey. And most days it's been very hard. Some extraordinarily, surreal things have happened to me while doing this work. I mean, not to even mention crossing the DMZ and now, sort of negotiating with North Korea and South Korea, and, the UN command, which is really the US forces in Korea. So it's been an extraordinarily amazing journey. And, doing it with a sisterhood of women is has just been the best part. And I feel so lucky that I could do this meaningful work and try to make a contribution in my lifetime.
That's great, and some of the things that you're saying. I mean, it's great to hear about how you got involved in it, because there's so many stories that I hear from women of color about, their interest in issues of peace and security that were sparked sometimes by an individual, a mentor, and just kind of waking up a part of themselves that they, it just put them in a whole different direction. And I guess that's true for people in general. But there's some great stories out there, similar to yours, about how so many women of color have gotten interested in some of these fields. And I happen to know Peter Hayes, and I used to actually work at the Ford Foundation. So, it's great hearing your stories. It actually brings back some of my own memories, and also working with Bob Bellucci as well. So, what were, I mean, I want to get back to you said some of the experiences were surreal. I want to get back to that, but what were some of the challenges that you faced when you decided that you wanted to start your organization?
Well, it was, I mean, I had, I'd say like my work, I mean, especially, in my 30s after I left Georgetown and left, the Nautilus Institute, really kind of had two tracks. Like by day, I largely worked at women's organizations. I worked for many years as the International Peace and Solidarity Director at the Women of Color Resource Center, which was really started by Linda Burnham and Angela Davis and Miriam Ching-Louie, a lot of women that had been part of this third world network, really supporting, liberation struggles in Africa and the Americas and in South Asia. And so I did that for a few years, and then I went to go work as the senior policy analyst at the Global Fund for Women, which is the largest women's fund supporting, grassroots women's organizing in 170 countries. So that was kind of like my day job. But by moonlight, I was a Korea peace activist. So I actually started the Korea Policy Institute with a few other Korean American scholars. Really felt like, I wasn't the PhD, but there were plenty of PhDs of Korean Americans that really needed to be organized. And so I helped create that think tank because I felt like, this is about Korea. This is about the people. And who is giving that perspective? I mean, far too many white men are speaking about Korea without having any kind of connection to the people or to the history or to the land. And so I really felt it was important to organize Korean Americans to do that. So that was I would say Women Cross TMZ and my doing this work was kind of the confluence of those two kind of areas of my life and my work. But it was in 2009 I was working at the Global Fund for Women, and we had just launched a initiative called Women Dismantling Militarism. And we were raising money to support women in conflict zones. And we had just screened Abigail Disney's film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about the extraordinary organizing by Liberian women crossing religious lines, Christian, Muslim, to end conflict and to confront Charles Taylor. And that was so, it had such an impact on me that actually several nights after watching that film, I had woken up in the middle of the night and I turned on the computer and I read this New York Times article about the Imjin River, which is in Korea, runs north to south. It's sort of through the heart of the Korean peninsula. And these songs and poems have been written about it. You know, it's like birds can fly across the Imjin River, but why can't I see my loved one? And so it was flooding. And Chae Sang-hoon from the New York Times wrote this piece about how North Korea allegedly lifted the floodgates without informing South Korea. And the two leaders at the time was Kim Jong-il, who is Kim Jong-un's father, and Lee Myung-bak, the former CEO of Hyundai. And so what happened was, you know, it led to flooding in South Korea, and several people were killed, including a father and his young son who were fishing early in the morning. And I just remember like reading that and just being both heartbroken and angry. And I went back to sleep, and that's when I had this dream, Bonnie. And the dream was that I was wading in the river, and it was before the crack of dawn, and I was with others. And I think it was because I was born in South Korea. Most of my family are in South Korea, and just being situated there, wondering if, you know, they were going to come, and they being the North Koreans. And just as the sun rose over the horizon, there was this glow of light that was flowing down the river, and it was people. And soon, you know, that kind of morphed into this incredible scene of family reunions. I'm sure all of your listeners must have seen at some point, you know, during the sunshine years, seeing elderly siblings from both North and South Korea who haven't seen each other for like 65 years, like embrace one another. And you know, so it's just that powerful scene. But I don't know, it's like maybe because I'm in the diaspora, I didn't want to just stop there. I wanted to know where the source of the light was coming from. And so I kept wading up the river. And that's when I came upon the source of the light, which was a circle of women. And they were stirring something in a big kettle. And whatever they were stirring, they poured into these vessels that then became the light that flowed down the river. And I woke up, it must have been like 5 in the morning. And I said to my husband, I know who will end the war. Women will end the Korean War. And of course, he looked at me totally befuddled and just said, you're crazy, and go back to sleep. But, you know, it really, I ruminated on that for many years. And I said, I need to know what has been the history of North and South Korean women trying to connect across that most fortified border in the world. And so fortunately, I got this fellowship at the University of Michigan, where I was able to, through oral history, through interviews with women in South Korea, about this history. And you know what I found was that the first meeting of North and South Korean women took place in 1991. And who was it organized by? A Japanese woman. And I just thought, oh my God, that is so powerful, given the kind of colonial history of Japan occupying Korea for 35 years, my parents having grown up in that period, and the role that a Japanese woman, like somebody outside of the peninsula, could play. And so I really, I was inspired that international women could do our part to help bridge the division, bridge the state of enmity and war between North and South Korea. And so then in like 2013, I got this flash in my email about 5 Kiwis who rode their motorbikes across the DMZ. And I just thought, that is so like weird and surreal. And if they could do it, women could do it. And so that was in 2013. And then I think it was in 2000. Yeah, so it was in 2013. And I wrote to Gloria Steinem, who I had met a few years before. And I said, Gloria, I wrote to her an email and I said, if women could cross the DMZ in the service of peace, would you do it? And she wrote me, I think literally in like 3 minutes. And she said, of course I would do it. I was in high school during the Korean War and I lost several classmates to that war. And I would do my small part to help with the healing. And, you know, that was just the response I got from so many women. Lema Gabowi, Abigail Disney, Medea Benjamin, you know, Alice Walker actually wanted to go on the journey. And so it just coincided that the guy I had met on my first trip in 2004 to North Korea was a guy named Pak Chol, who had been appointed to work as a counselor in the DPRK mission to the UN. So it was just serendipity that I had known him. We had built a relationship when I was in North Korea, a very heartfelt one. And so I wrote him an email and I said, this is a wild idea, but what do you think about women, many from the countries that participated in the war, crossing the DMZ, walking for peace and for the end of the war? And he wrote me back and he said, it's a crazy idea and it's a brilliant idea and you should go to Pyongyang to pitch it. And so that's basically
great.
The beginning of this wild story.
That's amazing that you just sent an email and everybody was just so responsive. I mean, I think that's really positive that there was so much energy and a desire to try something different and to support women and what women can do to make change to a very difficult situation. So, I mean, that's amazing. I know you must have been, getting those responses, you must have been, oh my goodness, this is great, you know?
Yeah, we're onto something powerful.
Yes. And that people were recognizing what can be done, which I
totally
think. So why don't we, I want to get back to some of the things you said about the surreals. I like that you said that because I think there's a lot packed into that. So why don't we fast forward to now and the situation that we have right now with
surreal.
Yeah, with so much going on with the meetings between leaders in the region, the upcoming summit, the back and forth with that with the U.S. and North Korea. And I know you were there recently. Talk a little bit about how this situation, how this the environment that we've seen in the past month or so. How are you taking all of that in with your organization? How are you thinking about what opportunities that offers or what challenges that offers now?
Well, I mean, it's been at a breakneck pace and completely head spinning day to day. The summit is on, the summit is off. And, you know, it's been work to try to take it all in and try to be responsive and try to, you know, put in a historical perspective and try to bring in a woman's perspective, a gender perspective into this. But, you know, I would first start by saying that we get so much misinformation about Korea and North Korea and South Korea. And that it's just so much work to basically even start with the basics, that there was a Korean War, that the US led the UN command, which is not really the UN, but it's like the first coalition of the willing. There were 24 countries that participated in the Korean War. That, you know, it's more than just a civil war between North and South Korea. And so, you know, it's like you have to do all of that kind of basic education, and then the kind of like dialing back a lot of the propaganda against North Korea. I mean, we've been at war with North Korea for 70 years. It's sort of like Cuba, you know, having vilified so much like the Castro regime and the system. And while completely agree that North Korea and Cuba are very different, you know, I mean, think about the Northeast Asia region, what surrounds the Korean Peninsula: Japan, China, Russia. And so, you know, that is probably like a tinderbox region. I mean, that's, you know, the greatest number of expenditures on the military is like definitely in that region. And nuclear armed countries, Russia, China, North Korea. So there's just so much work to kind of do that contextualizing. But, you know, what do I make of it? I think it's a historic moment, and I credit significantly Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president. I credit the social movements, the Candlelight Revolution that swept him into power, that gave him a mandate to pursue a peace treaty with North Korea, to be the kind of interlocutor between the US and North Korea, to kind of bridge the gap between the two sides. We know that North Korea, you know, their single focus is a peace treaty. They want to end the state of enmity and war with the United States. The US is single focused on denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And so I think, you know, what South Korea and Moon Jae-in has been doing so masterfully is trying to say both need to go at the same time. And North Korea is not going to give up their nuclear weapons unless they have security assurances that we won't conduct a first strike against them. And you know, the U.S. won't pursue a peace treaty unless they know for sure that North Korea is in a process of denuclearization. So I think it's an extraordinary moment. And I feel sometimes my greatest challenge is among my progressive allies and among my liberal friends who are usually on the side of peace, but because they so dislike and detest Donald Trump, which I completely agree, we shouldn't miss this historic moment, that this is a 70-year conflict, that Korea was the beginning of the Cold War, and not just in terms of McCarthyism and the kind of anti-communist rhetoric, but in terms of the military-industrial complex, you know, that ushered in like massive military spending and the proliferation of U.S. bases. So how could we put an end to this conflict that could have this incredible domino effect, not just for peace in the region, potentially achieving a nuclear-free zone in Northeast Asia? I just think that, you know, peace on the peninsula has huge implications and possibilities for world peace. And, you know, so it's a little dizzying to be, for example, on the AM Joy show this morning and having, you know, somebody like David Corn, who is from Mother Jones, a progressive magazine, you know, basically poo-poo the situation with Trump because, you know, we so mistrust Donald Trump. But it's, you know, I bring it back to, this is about the Korean people. This is about what South Korea and our major U.S. ally wants, is an end to the war. We know that North and South Korea, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in on April 27th met at Panmunjom, and they declared an end to this war and a new era of peace. So, you know, that peace train has left the station. And I think, you know, it's really a great day that the U.S. is actually, like as Donald Trump put it yesterday in his press conference, you know, we are talking about ending a 70-year conflict. That should not be, you know, I mean, I understand we don't need to go into the situation with rose-colored lenses, but let's also take in the significance of what that means.
Great. And I like that you also shed some light on the role of South Korea. I think we get so tied up into the discussions of how much of a role Trump did or didn't have in all of this that we sometimes don't credit enough, I think, the role of South Korea and the mandate that that they had, that Moon had to do what he's been doing. So I'm glad that you raised that point as well, and that folks can hear that side of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, Bonnie, it's like we often hear so much in the media that it's North Korea that's driving a wedge between the U.S. and ROK, and it's like, what happened last year? But a ton of fire and fury. I mean, of course, North Korea tested like over 20 missiles and a nuclear weapon. They're really like quickly trying to achieve an effective deterrence against a U.S. first strike. So, and Donald Trump. I mean, when he first went to Asia in November, I always bring up this point, which is there was a Pew study that found that 3 out of 4 South Koreans said they feared Donald Trump more than they did Kim Jong Un. So, the only wedge that was really being driven that really forced South Korea to actually stand up to the US, because when North Korea conducted that long-range missile in November, Moon Jae-in said he condemned North Korea for doing that, for its provocative belligerence, but he also sent a message to Donald Trump and to the US and said, there won't be a war as long as I am president, because it would have devastating consequences, not just for North Korea, but the counter retaliation on South Korea. The Congressional Research Service said that in the first few hours of a conventional conflict, 300,000 people would be killed. So, the Korean people don't take that lightly. And, I think Trump pushed a little too hard, the whole bloody no strike thing. And that's why Moon has such popularity right now, why 85% of South Koreans have his back and say what you're doing in terms of engagement and diplomacy with North Korea is the right thing. So, let's not forget, the kind of really provocative actions that took place last year, and how much, our government has took a lot of responsibility for escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula.
Great. I think, and that's a great perspective, because I think most people are saying, I mean, those who want to promote a certain viewpoint like to say, well, it's that escalation that led to the talks. But there's another side of the coin as well to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great that
Yep.
you're so just briefly, going back to some of the challenges you said that you mentioned, and the surreal moments. Is this, I guess, would this time right now be a surreal moment, or what have some of those been? I can only imagine.
It's been so crazy. Well, I mean, just most recently, I mean, we were in South Korea last week. Women Cross DMZ and the Nobel Women's Initiative organized a delegation of 30 women to go to South Korea. We wanted to cross the DMZ, but North Korea said, please, can you just postpone it until after the summit? And the South Korean women said, no, we really, May 24th, International Women's Day for Peace and Disarmament, is an important time for us to gather. And so we made the decision. It's, South Korea and Moon Jae-in is the country we need to support right now. And so we all gathered in Seoul, and we did a women's DMZ peace walk on the southern side of the DMZ. But I would say that it was pretty surreal to have just finished a all women's symposium at the National Assembly in Seoul, which is, their U.S. Congress. And to basically be planning a meeting the next morning with the U.S. Embassy in Seoul to talk about the need for this historic summit to take place and to support the Korea peace process. And at 11:30 that night, to get a phone call from one of the South Korean sisters whose father used to be the Minister of Unification under Kim Dae-jung, who really was the forefront of the Sunshine Policy, and to say, oh my God, Moon Jae-in just flew back to South Korea after meeting with Trump, and Trump wrote a letter to Kim Jong-un canceling the summit in a breakup letter. And then, to basically go to the embassy meeting the next morning and have a really hard-nosed but a constructive dialogue with them. And it was really, it was kind of amusing because here we were a delegation of 12 women, and sisters that came from Guam, sisters, that are like from Hawaii, the false missile alert, who would be in the crosshairs of any kind of conflict between the US and North Korea, all sitting around a table together. And they had 4 men at the US Embassy. There was the charge d'affaires, and there were 3 white guys and 1 Korean American guy. And, it was tense because they also didn't get wind of Donald Trump doing this until they got a phone call from the brew house.
Wow.
And so, it was like tense, and, it was great to be saying, look, I think we're all feeling very tense given what just happened, but we're here to dialogue with you. We are here to build a relationship with you. We want to explore with you how the peace process can get back on track, and how women can help support it in the service of peace. And, just by just saying, you and I, we clearly have differences of opinions, but we believe in dialogue, was, I think, it was a real icebreaker. And you can just feel like everybody kind of breathing a sigh of relief, and then we can have dialogue. And I think it was really constructive. And so anyway, it was just hilarious because after having that, little did they know we had planned a protest outside of the US Embassy. And so we did that. And then, later that evening, Canada and Norway co-hosted a reception for us. And so we had to see the US Embassy guy again at that reception. So, it was a little surreal that way. But, this is what we have to do. I think women have to, women peacemakers and builders, we have to maintain, true to our principles and our integrity. But we have to maintain that firm commitment to dialogue, and be the bridge. And, we don't have, luckily, because of the way that we've grown up, with all these gender binaries and all the kind of various responsibilities that women have to do as caretakers of the home, of our communities, of our families, that we don't have that kind of masculine posturing that we need to do to prove a point or something. But that we really, that I think there is something very disarming about women, and a trust that we really are trying to do this to advance something that's in the greater good. So it was kind of surreal to have that day. And then of course the next day, marching with 1,200 women in the South Korean side of the DMZ, to know that just a few miles away that Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un were meeting at Panmunjom to try to get the U.S.-North Korea talks back on track. Mm-hmm. So, but there's so many more stories. I need to write a book, Bonnie.
Yes, I can only imagine how many stories you have in your journeys. So this is good. Well, one thing I want to do as we get toward the end is, and we were talking earlier, one of the goals, major goal of WCAPS is to strengthen the voices of women of color in peace, security, and conflict issues, and also to make sure that we're part of decision making, that we can have a role in influencing peace and security moving forward. And you are doing exactly that. And, you are, bringing in women as well as women of color into this important issue, important security issue, important peace issue, and conflict issue. And I find that great that, I can point to you and other women of color who are really in the forefront and, making things happen. So that's really wonderful for me because it helps me feel very happy to see that happening, and it's such an important part of what I'm trying to do with my organization. And as you have gone through these journeys, I wonder, if you were sitting, and you may have done this many times already, sitting, talking to a group of young women, particularly women of color, let's say they're high schoolers. What would be your message to them about playing a role in peace and security in the future, and overcoming the challenges that they may have in doing that, in their careers?
Well, first, I salute you for starting WCAPS, and I, I feel that you are in the frontier in pioneering a very important organization that really brings more women of color into this field. I would say to these young, bright, brilliant young women that they are who we are waiting for. Um, that this country has both a beautiful history in terms of its diversity, in terms of its embracing different cultures and religions, um, and yet it also has a very tragic history of occupying other countries, so sovereign countries, a history of genocide of African Americans, of Native Americans, and that there still needs to be reckoning about what is the spirit of the United States of America, and that we are on the verge of being a nation of at least half people of color, and that includes African Americans, it includes Latin Americans, it includes Asian Americans, Native Americans, it includes a nation of immigrants that were forcefully brought here, or willingly came here to advance their the economic well-being of their families. And so we have to shape a different kind of foreign policy that isn't the kind of the brutal one that has impacted our homelands, and that can be a true alliance of people, and that so much of what a just foreign policy can do is not just in terms of how the US can be perceived around the world, but also it improves our security at home. And we know in terms of the domestic demographics who are the most disproportionately impacted in terms of jobs, in terms of income and wealth inequality in this country. Women of color are always at the bottom of that barrel. And, foreign policy and international relations has been far too long the domain of white men, and the kind of the way in which kind of patriarchy has been used, and the kind of the intersection of patriarchy and sexism and racism has really defined kind of a US foreign policy agenda. And that, we have seen in the last few years the rise of women's power through the form of women's marches, through the Me Too movement. And we have a job to do to take on perhaps the most patriarchal area. And that, we have to do it in a way that is true to what we stand for and who we are. And that we don't have to take on that kind of masculine armor to be in this field, because we don't want to become like them. We actually want to be who we are and to advance our vision for a world that's more just, more equal, and that where we are all liberated. And so I would say, you are who we are waiting for. We need you to get into this field, because how we shape U.S. foreign policy will always dictate whether how much we will spend on our military spending, which is $700 billion, which is more than the next 10 countries combined. And, if we continue at that pace, we will never achieve true security at home and invest in the things that we know will give us security at home, in our families, and in our communities. And so we need you to get to work now to try to transform what the United States of America could be at home and to the broader world.
That's great, and I like how you said you need to get to work now, because it's interesting as we see, after the Parkland shootings, for example, how active our younger generation is already, and it's really inspiring. And so I think, saying, and letting them know that they can play a role now, even at their young age, to get involved and to feel like they have a role to play, I think is really, really important. So thank you for that. And I'm hoping that our young people will actually continue to do that. But your work is so great. And I'm also glad that you are our Women of the Month for June for WCAPS. And, we couldn't be more honored to have you, part of this group. And, as I said, you are out there doing the things that this organization is trying to promote. So thank you for that. And I guess any last words that you might have on this important work and what you've achieved so far in this work and with trying to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula?
No, I feel so deeply honored, Bonnie, to be recognized by your organization. And I feel so deeply grateful that you have started this important organization that really kind of creates a sisterhood for women of color that are trying to do this work, because it is tough. It is tough to be in this field where, it's hard to be taken seriously because of, the perception of who is the expert, right, on security issues. And so I just want to thank you for taking your leadership and doing, and creating such an important organization for women of color, and to, create a community for those of us that are working together to advance a more just and peaceful and secure world. So that's all I have to say. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my stories today.
Well, thank you for taking the time, because I know how busy you are. As I said, I know that your work that you're doing for the Peace in the Peninsula, but also seeing you on TV now, and it's great that people are recognizing your work. It's great that you're able to let folks know not only what you're doing, but the important role that women can play in peace, security, and conflict transformation. So keep up the good work, and we're watching and learning and being inspired. So thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone who took the time to listen today. I think it was an excellent interview here, because we have an excellent person who's talking about her work, which is really moving things in the right direction for all of us. So thank you again, Christine. Thank you, all the listeners, and we'll be back again with another podcast soon.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you for joining Women of Color, Advancing Peace and Security. Please visit WCAPS.org. That's WCAPS.org.